Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Many of you out there have requested that I do another episode about UFO healing cases. And by UFO healing, I mean someone who has experienced an improvement in their health as a direct result of a UFO encounter. And there are a lot of cases like these, far more than most people know. In fact, I've written a book about this subject called The Healing Power of UFOs, and it documents more than 300 cases coming from all over the world, reaching back more than 100 years, all the way up to pretty much the current day. I can tell you that most major researchers out there have multiple cases like these. It's definitely a part of the contact experience. And what's really interesting is where these cases take place. Most of them do take place on board a UFO, but there's a portion of them that take place in people's homes. Some people are outside, perhaps taking a walk or driving or what have you, and they have an encounter which ends up with them being healed. But about 5 to 10% of these cases actually do take place inside a hospital room. I know how unusual that sounds, but as any investigator will tell you, ETs can visit a person anywhere. I have cases that are taking place in hotel rooms in very crowded areas. So yeah, just about anywhere, and that includes hospital rooms. And for one or two cases, I think we could discount it, but no, there are a lot. In fact, in this episode today, I'm going to cover 17 cases in which people make this claim, that they were visited in their hospital room by an ET and they were healed as a result of this encounter. These are all different types of ETs. These are all different types of illnesses. Again, these cases come from all over the world, reaching very far back in time and pretty much up to the current day. So I'm going to go through these chronologically. And the first case I'd like to cover, I call My Sight Restored. This took place in 1945, April of 1945, on the island of Okinawa. The main witness in this case is a gentleman by the name of Howard Menger. He would soon have many other encounters following this one, and would become a very well-known UFO contactee, and in fact one of the first people in the United States to come forward and make claims of having contact with UFOs and extraterrestrials. In April of 1945, on the island of Okinawa in the Pacific Ocean, Howard Menger, then a professional painter, was on one of the aircraft that saturated the Japanese-held island with bombs. And after dropping hundreds of bombs and peppering the shoreline with machine gun fire, the Americans were able to take control of the island. Still, the Japanese did continue to attack. Some had managed to survive the bombing by hiding in caves on the island, and it was these soldiers who continued to attack in the style of guerrilla warfare. Also, a nearby Japanese-held island shelled Okinawa constantly. Although it caused little real damage, it was one of these shells which proved to be disastrous for Howard Menger. One day, as he was patrolling the airstrip, another shell from the nearby island fell short of its target and landed on the airstrip. Howard Menger heard it coming, so he fell to the ground and stayed low. After the explosion, he was relieved to have escaped injury, or so he thought, because then he felt something hit his eye. As he says, "As I got to my feet, I felt something stinging in my right eye. I put my hand to my eye and managed to pick something out with my fingers. It was a piece of shrapnel." So Howard Menger was rushed to the medical tent where he received treatment. Unfortunately, this eye became badly infected, and before long, he was totally blind in his right eye. Of course, he was unable to perform his duties, and he remained in the medical tent under the care of the overworked doctors and nurses. Now, despite treatment, this eye infection worsened and soon spread to his other eye, and soon Howard Menger found himself totally blind. He was, as you might expect, devastated. He kept the news from his family back home, but this wasn't the only secret Howard Menger was keeping, because ever since he was a little boy, he claims to have been repeatedly contacted by human-like aliens who claim to be from various planets in our solar system. Now, through the years, Howard had many typical contactee adventures. He said he was taken on board a UFO, shown the moon. He was given instructions about how to build an energy-free motor, which is not uncommon. He was told many predictions, which he said later came true. He was even able to take some of his friends to view the ET's craft and was provided with further demonstrations to prove the existence of his ET friends. He was even allowed to take photographs, some of which appear in a book he wrote about his experiences from outer space to you. And like many contactees, Howard says he was healed by the ETs. As he writes in his book, "Something happened in that tent that I have often wondered about. Perhaps I can never be certain." So while in the hospital, Howard was visited by an unidentified, but he says very kind lady. Howard asked if she was a nurse, but the woman did not reply and instead told him that he was the one she had come to see. Howard was struck by the fact that she seemed to know a lot about him. In fact, he had a sneaking suspicion that she might be one of his extraterrestrial friends sent to help him. As Howard writes, "She assured me my sight would be restored." And very gradually it was. Howard's sight returned, and he was finally able to behold the lady who had helped him, who he describes as, quote, "an attractive woman with wavy brown hair, dark eyes, and fine white teeth." She looked like a normal human. She was wearing the normal Army nurse's uniform. And as Howard said, "Although I suspected she was one of the space people, she never made herself known directly. Near the time of my release, she said that I would meet very soon an interesting person. I assumed it would be another contact." So this turned out to be true because 2 weeks later, Howard had a very strong impulse to drive to a remote area on the island. He did so, and there he met a human-looking ET, and this gentleman told him that there would soon be a terrible bomb. Although the ET didn't mention Howard's recent healing, he alluded as to why it had been done. The ET told Howard, quote, "We have been spending a lot of time conditioning you and preparing you for your work to come. We are contacting people all over the world." So he would later go on board and see this nurse who had apparently healed him. And of course, this prediction about a terrible bomb did come true, and we now know it to be the atomic bomb. A fascinating case, and only one of well over a dozen cases involving people whose vision was healed as a result of a UFO encounter. We've got quite a few cases like this, and this is just one of them. The Howard Menger case is somewhat controversial. He certainly does have his detractors, but I will say that no one's ever been able to successfully debunk his case. It matches up with many, many other cases in terms of details, and in fact, he presents more evidence than the vast majority of people who claim these kinds of experiences. So yeah, I think it's a case we should definitely take an objective look at, and that's why I included it here. Now let's move to our next case, which I call Eyes Filled with Great Compassion. This is a really interesting case which took place in June of 1946 in Camp Lee, Virginia. This is another encounter which took place in an Army hospital, and I think you'll find it a fascinating case. This case comes from Timothy Good and was published in his excellent book, Above Top Secret. I highly recommend it. If you know any skeptics, give them this book. You cannot walk away from reading this book not believing in UFOs. It was June of 1946 that a gentleman by the name of Alan Edwards was admitted to an Army hospital at Camp Lee, Virginia. One evening he was wandering through the hospital seeking company when he spotted a very unusual looking man. He was struck by his odd appearance, so Alan walked across the room and sat down on the vacant bunk next to this man. Alan turned out to be an academically trained portrait painter with a very thorough knowledge of anatomy, and he instantly noticed several strange irregularities about this individual. This man had an extremely high forehead, perfectly formed features, unusually radiant blonde hair, a flawless complexion, and extraordinary blue eyes, which, as Alan says, were, quote, filled with great compassion. So he stared at this man in absolute fascination, and then suddenly he was overcome with this feeling of well-being, to the point that he felt it was some kind of spiritual experience just to be in the presence of this young man. Before he could investigate further, Alan was called away for his own medical examination. But later that evening, he saw a young man being brought into the hospital for treatment. This young man had been beaten badly in a drunken brawl. He had 2 black eyes which were swollen shut, a badly bruised forehead, his nose appeared to be broken, and this man was put in the cot next to Alan Edwards, who now had trouble falling asleep because of this man's loud groans of pain. So the next morning came, Alan sat down for breakfast, and this is when he saw the strange-looking man that he had seen earlier on his right. Then he saw the boy who had been injured the night before, except now he looked absolutely normal. All signs of his injuries were gone. Alan Edwards just could hardly believe what he was seeing. As he says, "My eyes rested on a young lad seated at the end of the table. This was the same boy who had been brought in the night before, the one who had been so badly beaten. Yet it couldn't be. There wasn't a blemish on his face." So who cured this boy? Alan never found out for sure, but as he says, quote, "I felt strongly that the man seated on my right had been responsible for this miraculous transfiguration." Now later, Alan would have contacts with this strange man and other ETs. And in fact, in Seattle, Washington, Alan says he was hospitalized for a respiratory ailment. He became very curious about 2 very much normal-looking, human-looking hospital attendants who repeatedly proved their ability to read his every thought. They were telepathic to a degree that they were reading his mind. And while in their presence at this hospital in Seattle, other strange things began to happen. This is so unusual. Alan says he felt compelled to get up and attend to various patients, performing a type of hands-on psychic healing. As he says, "I found myself administering to them with expert hands, which did not somehow seem to belong to me." He was discharged shortly later and always regrets that he didn't question the 2 strange hospital attendants further. But this is a good example of someone who's developed healing abilities as a result of UFO contact. I like that case. The witness sounds very credible, very sincere. Timothy Good is an excellent and very well-respected researcher. I think it's an all-around very interesting and very early case, which that alone I think makes it important. We don't have a whole lot of cases before the modern age of UFOs from 1947 onwards. And yeah, that one occurred in 1945, so super interesting. Now let's move to the next case, which I call "You Were Supposed to Lose That Finger." This occurred sometime in the 1960s in New Jersey, and the main witness in this case is a gentleman by the name of Richard Rylka. Not a whole lot of information about him. His story comes from just one source, one researcher who investigated his case. But this is a very interesting event of a healing that took place in a hospital. 2, actually. The investigator in this case is Joseph J. Randazzo. He was the editor and publisher of the UFO Library magazine and the author of the book The Contactee's Manuscript, which this account was published in. The witness is Richard Rylka. He was born in 1941 in New Jersey, and he has received several healings. One occurred very early in the 1950s in New Jersey. At that time, Richard Rylka was just a young child. He was playing outside in the snow with his friends. They were sleigh riding down steep hills near their homes. While racing down the hill, Richard was unable to steer his sled and he crashed into a car that was driving up a hill. The driver didn't even see Richard, who was pushed under the car, thrown off the sled, and knocked unconscious. And by the time the driver found him, Richard had been lying on his left side in the snow for quite a few minutes. His left ear was badly frostbitten. He ended up developing an ear infection, which completely destroyed his hearing in that ear. His doctors considered performing a mastoidectomy, but instead they decided to try the new drug penicillin, which was gaining in popularity at this time. Now, Richard Rylka had seen UFOs on several occasions. On a few occasions, he remembered going outside and being beamed or given messages telepathically from the ETs. As of yet, however, they had not visited him physically. But as he was recovering in the hospital, Richard was surprised when two human-looking figures introduced themselves as extraterrestrials, gave him the names Nepos and Koran, and came into his hospital room, they said, for the sole purpose of healing him. They were only able to effect a partial cure, using, quote, their own body energies. So this is, in essence, a psychic healing. These human-looking ETs were able to get rid of the pain and the pressure that Richard was feeling in his ear. After they left, he was still unable to hear out of that ear, but following several doses of penicillin, his hearing returned. This turned out to be Richard's first visitation and first healing, though it wouldn't be long before more followed. It was sometime in the 1960s that Richard was working for a medical firm, and he was instructed by his supervisor to transport a barrel of chemicals. Now, to do this, Richard had to operate a piece of heavy equipment called a drum lifter. You can see it here. Heavy machinery, as you may know, is often dangerous, and he was being careless or somehow got in an accident. His index finger became caught in this machinery and was badly crushed. And in fact, Richard's screams called the attention of coworkers who helped him to free his finger, which was, quote, white and terribly distorted. It was so badly damaged that Richard had no feeling in the finger at all. He was unable to move it. He was rushed to the company's first aid room, and the nurse was horrified and told him to go to the hospital at once. This was well beyond her capability to take care of. So he took a cab to Middlesex General Hospital in New Brunswick, New Jersey, where doctors immediately applied an ice pack and prepared for x-rays. Now, Richard was alone in the emergency room when suddenly these two ET friends of his, Koran and Nepos, appeared. They held their hands over his finger and once again cured him using psychic healing. Now, although this finger was numb for many months, this cure was apparently entirely effective enough to straighten the bone and close the broken skin. In fact, when the doctor returned, they found no signs of injury on his finger whatsoever and sent him back to work. Now later, Richard was contacted by the company nurse who had read his hospital file with disbelief. And she told Richard flat out, after seeing his finger and then reading this file, as she says, and I quote, "You were supposed to lose that finger." She demanded to know what happened, but Richard, like many people who experience these kinds of events, remained totally silent about what had happened to him. Another interesting healing case, injuries of some kind are probably the most common type of healing in association with a UFO encounter. I've got many very similar to that. The Richard Rylka case, again, not very well known, but I think certainly deserves to be. Some of his healings are really quite well verified. I didn't go into all of them here, but he has experienced multiple healings. He would be categorized, I think, as your typical contactee. None of his experiences have been frightening to him. Perhaps, this is simply how we categorize encounters. Abductee if you're afraid and feel like it's involuntary, and contactee if it was a benevolent experience for you. I've certainly talked to people who've had the same identical experience, but interpreted it in very different ways. Either way, it's a fascinating case. Now let's move to the next one, which I call We've Never Seen Anything Like It. This occurred in May of 1962 in Durham, England. I like this case because it gave me a clue as to who is being healed and why. And like many cases involving healings, they're medically verified, and this one really puzzled the doctors. These kinds of cases do leave a long trail of very confused and puzzled doctors who cannot explain how these witnesses are suddenly being healed without any intervention on their part. On Easter weekend in 1962, Fred White, an electronics specialist, decided to go fishing not far from his home near Durham, England. And while fishing, he had a very close-up sighting of a metallic craft with portholes. And in fact, through one of the portholes, Fred said he could see a human-looking person looking down at him. After about 5 minutes, this craft left, and that was the end of it, or so he thought. But 4 years later, in September of 1966, he started to experience severe pains in his chest and trouble breathing. He was hospitalized. They diagnosed him with a collapsed lung. Fred had no idea what was wrong with him, but to his dismay, x-rays revealed that he had a large hole in his lung. But it was during his stay in the hospital that Fred says he was visited by a man who he thought at first was just another doctor. However, this was no normal doctor. He looked very strange. He had a peculiar accent. When he entered the room, he immediately put his arm over Fred as if examining him, and this is when Fred noticed that the man wore, quote, some kind of watch, which glowed like no timepiece I had ever seen. So this man began to discuss Fred's symptoms with him, and this man expressed some interest in Fred's work with electronics, and said that it was important he continue working with electronics, and that he would heal him. After several minutes, the strange doctor left, and as soon as he left, Fred immediately felt better. He could breathe without pain. The doctors gathered around and demanded more tests. Of course, x-rays were again taken, and to the surprise of the doctors, no hole in his lung could be found, and Fred was given a clean bill of health. He says this man, looked pretty much normal, but did have a weird exotic eyes, was dressed strangely, not in any way he could completely describe, but it was mostly this weird timepiece or instrument on his wrist that impressed Fred. And of course the doctors were absolutely astonished. As one doctor said, your lung is completely inflated. The hole you had in there is healed. We've never seen anything like it. So Fred is convinced that the man who visited him in the hospital cured him of his illness. He also suspects that this is probably the same person he saw through the porthole of that UFO while fishing 4 years earlier. A very interesting case, and only one of many cases involving heart healings that I've documented. This case of Fred White is important because it gave me a clue, as I said earlier, about who is being healed and why. I found that over 50% of cases involving healings do occur to contactees, people who have a long history of encounters. But I also found another pattern, which you can definitely see in this episode, and that is people who are being healed are people who are doing good work for humanity in some capacity. So we have a lot of doctors and nurses and teachers and artists and environmentalists and social workers and this kind of thing. And it appears that Fred White was healed because he was an electronics specialist and the ETs felt he was doing important work. It's certainly an interesting correlation and detail. All right, now let's move to the next case, which I call the miracle patient. This one occurred in 1967 in Lima, Peru. The witness is Ludwig F. Paulman. He ended up writing an entire book about his experiences, which are very, very extensive, involving contact with human-like ETs. And I call this one the miracle patient because that is what the doctors in the hospital called Ludwig after he experienced a remarkable recovery from an illness which was quite serious. In 1967, Ludwig F. Paulman was hospitalized in the Maison Francaise Hospital of Lima, Peru. He had been experiencing severe pains which were quickly diagnosed as kidney problems. 2 years earlier, in 1965, Ludwig was traveling through Europe. his career as an international health food processor and distributor made him, as he says, a perpetual globe trotter. It was while he was in India that he met a normal-looking, human-looking gentleman who introduced himself as Satu Ra. And after a few weeks of friendship, Satu Ra made an amazing statement. He told Ludwig that he, Satu, was actually an extraterrestrial, not from this planet. Now, Ludwig was initially skeptical of such an outrageous claim, but he was soon given reason to believe, because Satu Ra actually invited Ludwig aboard his craft. Ludwig, as you might expect, accepted the offer and had an amazing and very extensive series of encounters with these human-looking extraterrestrials. Like many contactees, he was told many things, and like many contactees, he later received this amazing healing. He was in the wilderness in Lima, Peru, when his kidney pain first appeared. He sought treatment and was happy to be in the Maison Francais Hospital, which was well known in the area for its expert doctors and modern equipment. The doctors told Ludwig that he would have to undergo an operation to alleviate his kidney pain, and Ludwig agreed as his fever was getting worse and the pain had him totally incapacitated. But it was while he was in his hospital room, Ludwig awoke one evening to find a visitor in his room. And he recognized this person instantly. It was ZT, who is Satu Ra's sister, whom he had met earlier on board this UFO craft. This lady wasted no time and immediately began treating Ludwig for his condition. She did so by first passing her hands over his body. She then gave him a small pill to eat. Then, as quickly and as mysteriously as she had arrived, she departed. And just within minutes after her administrations, Ludwig's condition made a complete reversal. He says he was instantly free of pain, his fever broke, and as far as he could tell, he was completely healed. Later, the doctors came in to examine him, and they were absolutely stunned. They realized that Ludwig was now completely healthy, but they could not explain why. This case, per Ludwig, is very well verified by his doctors, who knew that he should have been on the operating table. As Ludwig says, "All of this may be checked by any of my readers. I became the miracle patient of the famous Maison Francais Hospital in Lima, Peru." And in fact, Ludwig had been scheduled for his operation that morning. So when the doctors examined him and found him perfectly healthy, they demanded he undergo a whole new battery of tests. And it was these tests that verified the obvious, that Ludwig was perfectly healthy. As one doctor told him, "You're fit as a flea. This is really baffling. Yesterday you were a very sick man, and today you seem to be a different person." Ludwig never did have any more problems with his kidneys, but he did have several more contacts with his alien friends and ended up writing a book about his UFO experiences. I find it a little bit amusing to see the reaction from all these doctors who are just struggling to figure out how these patients are being healed and fixed of a condition that they themselves were not able to heal. That is an important detail as well. This shows how truly advanced the ETs are. If they're curing chronic conditions, well, clearly these conditions aren't chronic. And I think we could learn a lot from how these ETs are healing people. The whole medical community really, I think, should pay close attention to these kinds of cases. Because yeah, we could learn a lot from the ETs about how to treat people of all these different kinds of conditions. Which brings us to the next case, which I call "This is Impossible." This took place in 1971 in Laguna, California, to a gentleman by the name of Dr. Fred Bell. He was quite prominent in the UFO community a few decades ago. Again, a pretty controversial character. Certainly has his detractors, but has a lot of supporters as well. Claims to have had contact with human-looking ETs, and claims a very interesting healing in a hospital room as well. In 1971, Southern California contactee and scientist Dr. Fred Bell and two of his friends were victims of a crude pipe bomb explosion. Per Fred Bell, all 3 of them were injured, but he was thrown off of his feet and onto the sidewalk where he lost consciousness. He was rushed to Laguna Memorial Hospital in Southern California. When he woke up, he discovered that his left hand, upper left shoulder, and neck were badly burned. He also sustained a minor skull fracture and had painful bruises all over his body. However, Fred says he was in contact with human-looking extraterrestrials. He said these contacts began as a young child and continued throughout his life. He says they had given him life-saving warnings on several occasions and all kinds of valuable advice. He says they also gave him an innocuous-looking necklace called a, quote, receptor, and they told him that it would protect him from harm. While alone in the hospital room, Fred Bell says this necklace heated up and sent, quote, marvelous energy into his body, and within minutes he was completely healed. And in fact, his friends who were visiting him at the time watched this with disbelief. The next morning, Fred says he very much enjoyed watching the hospital physicians run a number of tests in an attempt to explain his miraculous cure. One of the doctors told him, and I quote, "This is impossible. You have no trace of the severe burns that damaged your left hand, upper left shoulder, and your neck. There is no longer evidence of a skull fracture. And what's with all the bruises, huh? You were covered with bruises. Where did they disappear to?" Per Fred, the doctor was very upset and actually accused him of faking his injuries. But what Fred did not tell the doctor is about this, quote, receptor necklace, which he now believes cured him using, quote, some unknown energy. Now, Dr. Fred Bell was an inventor and actually constructed more of these necklaces. He founded a group called Paradigm and actually sold these necklaces to people. You can still find some of them online. I make no claims about whether or not these work. He apparently does have testimonials, but you can make up your own mind about it. I was a little bit reluctant to include the case of Dr. Fred Bell because it is quite controversial. He does have his detractors, but it is another example of someone who claims to have been healed in his hospital room as a result of ET contact. It's the fact that he sold these necklaces that kind of raises my eyebrows. He does have testimonials about it, but I don't know. You can make up your own minds about it. So let's move to the next case, which I call My Doctor Was Amazed. This occurred in November of 1981 in Hubbard, Oregon. The witnesses in this case are the Twiggs family, specifically Denise Twiggs. This is a really interesting case because the entire family claims to have had contact. It's a very extensive case involving multiple encounters and, in fact, multiple healings. But one did take place in a hospital room. One of the most unusual contact stories on record is that of the Twiggs family, Bert and Denise Twiggs, and their 3 children, which was written up in their book, Secret Vows. They have had multiple healing events, but important here is the one that occurred to Denise Twiggs in November of 1981. She had just given birth to her son, Christopher, by cesarean section. She had planned to deliver him naturally, but unforeseen complications demanded immediate surgery. It turned out that the umbilical cord was wrapped around Christopher's neck. Luckily, surgery went well. There were no other difficulties. Christopher was born a healthy, normal baby boy, but Denise was very disappointed to have had a C-section, as the recovery process is considerably longer than with natural birth. However, Denise did have extraterrestrial friends, and they visited her, she says, in the hospital room and actually sped up the healing process of her incision. As she says, they visited me, giving me a helping hand with my recovery. My human doctor was amazed at how quickly I was healing. Now, Denise didn't tell him about her ET encounters. A pretty interesting case. And yeah, I would recommend checking out that book, Secret Vows. It's quite an unusual contact case, but does appear to be legitimate. It's a fascinating account of how people can move from being quite scared of their encounters to having truly benevolent encounters. Now let's move to the next case, which I call a solution to my problem. This one occurred sometime in the summer of 1982 in Willamette Valley, Oregon. And this is another fascinating case involving someone who was cured of actually strep. Quite a few cases of people who are healed of colds and flus and various lung problems. This is one of them, and this case is super fascinating. This case comes from Whitley Strieber's Unknown Country website. It occurred in the summer of 1982 to a 13-year-old boy given the pseudonym Douglas, who lived in Willamette Valley, Oregon. He was taking swimming lessons at a local public pool when he contracted an aggressive strain of Streptococcus bacteria. And his condition deteriorated quite quickly, so he was rushed to the local hospital, which at that time was already overflowing with other strep patients. There was an outbreak at that time, and poor Douglas, his fever rose to 104 degrees. And despite antibiotic treatment, this infection spread to his kidneys. And doctors were actually worried that he might die. And I'll just let Douglas describe what happened next in his own words. As he says, "One night, a creature that I thought at first was some sort of nurse came to my bedside. She wore a hooded garb like the monks of old. She was round of body, and her face was this plastic-like skin. Her nose was only a V-shaped ridge. She said she had a solution to my problem and told me to relax. Out from her left sleeve came this thing that looked like a knobby rod of brushed aluminum. She pushed the rod-like thing against me, like an injection, into my left hip. I felt no needle, only something like an ice cube being pushed against the skin. The strange nurse then quickly left, and Douglas fell asleep. When he awoke the next morning, his fever had broken and his infection had begun to clear up. Later, his mother would also receive an even more remarkable healing by the same ETs, but that one occurred in her home. Interestingly, in 2016, a UFO was seen hovering directly over the Mackenzie-Willamette Hospital in Springfield, Oregon. How interesting that both the mother and the son were healed by ETs, or make these claims. That's also not unusual. When one person is having contact, many people in the family or people close to this person might experience contact as well. And again, healing is a big part of UFO contact. According to the Freeze study by Ray Hernandez, healing takes place in some 50% of the cases, which is exactly what Edith Fiore, PhD, found in her study, which she wrote about in her book Encounters. I'd say it turns up closer to 20 to 30% in my own research. MUFON did a study and found about 10%. Either way, that's significant. And I think it's undeniable that healing is a part of the UFO experience because there are so many people having these kinds of healings. Here's another one. This case I call totally recuperated. This one occurred in the summer of 1989 in Kyiv, Ukraine, and it's a fascinating case, which I think you'll find really interesting. In the summer of 1989, a gentleman by the name of Sergey K of Kiev, Ukraine, suffered a devastating stroke. It caused all kinds of symptoms. He was having trouble speaking. He had almost near total paralysis in his left hand. And while he was in the hospital recovering, sitting by the window, he suddenly saw these strange green orb-like lights approaching. These lights flickered, formed a kind of semicircle, and came right up to the window. Sergey says he suddenly felt mesmerized, entranced, and was unable to control his body. And when these lights reached him, a figure in a tight-fitting white suit appeared. Per Sergey, this was a tall man with long blonde hair. This man waved his hand over Sergey several times, causing Sergey to become nauseous and hot, and at this point he lost consciousness. When he awoke, the green lights were ascending from the balcony outside the window and moving away, and Sergey himself says he felt healthy and energetic. In fact, he immediately rose up and discovered that he could move his left hand freely. He felt almost totally recuperated from this stroke. which, as you can imagine, amazed his wife and the doctors. How interesting is that? Because medical science really has no super effective treatments to reverse a stroke, and yet somehow the ETs are able to do it. I've got quite a few cases in my book about this. There is one case, which I didn't cover here, but this does involve a boy who was cured of a stroke by medicine given to the hospital doorman, who gave it to the doctors to apply to the patient in the hospital room. This you can hear more about in my YouTube episode, the top 20 UFO healing cases. So that's why I didn't want to cover it here. A few of these cases I've already covered, so I didn't want this to be too repetitive. But it's certainly another interesting case of someone healed of a stroke. Now here's a case which I have not covered before in my YouTube episodes. This one I call Get Up and Go. This occurred on April 18, 1989 in Ukraine. And this is a really interesting case because it does have outside witnesses. This is someone who was basically brought back from a very much terminal condition. And it's such an interesting case in so many different ways. This case comes from respected Russian researcher Sergey Bulantsev. The witness is Ludmila Petrona. She was terminally ill with heart disease and was actually lying near death in her hospital room located in Krasnoperkabsk. This is in Crimea in Ukraine. Heart surgery had failed to help her. She was largely paralyzed and was declining quickly. And in fact, the nurses had placed her in a separate ward, rarely visited her, and poor Ludmila was just hoping that the end would come quickly. It was on the evening of April 18, 1989 that she woke up to a strong wind swirling through her room. This was weird because the doors were closed. The wind grew stronger. Suddenly a dazzling white light appeared, followed by a man dressed all in white, glowing with white light. In fact, the man's eyes seemed to radiate light. So Ludmila shouted out, "Who are you? Where do you come from?" The man replied, "We come from the 10th dimension. Don't be afraid. You will be able to walk." At this point, the room seemed to become hazy and the man disappeared and Ludmila lost consciousness. It was the next day that another patient, a lady from the neighboring ward, came to visit her and was shocked by her appearance and called Ludmila's husband. So he came and, examining her, lifting her arm, was amazed and puzzled to see these weird little unexplained red and white lights moving slowly over the body of the patient. Per Ludmila, she says she suddenly felt this extreme surge of energy. She felt something physically push her. She sat up in bed, and this is when she heard a loud voice clearly say, quote, "Get up and go, now or never." So Ludmila rose from her bed, and she was apparently cured. As researcher Sergey Bulantsev writes, Ludmila Petrona got up, took one step, then another. Now she can walk without difficulty. How interesting is that? This is another case of someone cured of a heart condition. Again, I got a lot of cases like this, but this one is so interesting because this person was basically at death's door and made a full recovery. Don't know quite how these guys are healing people, but it's very effective, usually. Not always. There are some cases where the healing doesn't quite work, as we'll see coming up. But man, that is just so fascinating to me, and it's a good reminder that there's always hope. You never know when a healing might occur. Now, let's move to another case, which I call I Was Saved. This occurred sometime in the 1990s. The location is not specified. I don't have hardly any information about this case, but I do know the person's name. She was very vehement that she was healed in the hospital. So I think it's an important case because, again, this shows that a person can be visited anywhere at any time and have a contact with extraterrestrials. This case comes from experiencer Joanie Ferris, and I'll just quote her as she says, "In my contact experience, I was saved. I was in a hospital suffering from pneumonia for 6 weeks, and nothing, absolutely no antibiotics were working on me. The specialists were trying penicillin after penicillin. Then one day I was taken up through the ceiling and blacked out. When I came back, I was in bed, and my fever had broke, and the pneumonia was gone. Joanie Ferris felt compelled to report her encounter after reading a quote from researcher Jacques Vallée in which he described procedures done upon humans by the ETs as, quote, sadistic. She vehemently disagreed with this characterization and writes, I have heard of cases of people being hurt from abduction, so there is both good and bad. We don't know what the ET researchers are trying to accomplish. In other words, the work may appear to be sadistic in the way an emergency medical team performing a life-saving operation, if not properly recognized and understood, could be considered sadistic. Again, I wish I had more information on that case. This is one of the problems with studying UFO healing cases. Studying UFOs in general is very difficult because people are very reluctant to come forward. But when it comes to healing cases, that's even more so. UFO healings have often been relegated to sort of the fringe of the fringe. And for that reason, many of them are not well covered or well investigated and receive only brief mention in the literature. But the fact that there are 300, well, it's closer to probably now to twice that number. But the fact that there are so many cases, I think, provides the best evidence that these kinds of events are taking place. It's also important because this shows a benevolent side to the ETs that doesn't get nearly the attention it deserves. And again, it appears to be that fear is what often causes people to label an encounter as negative, which is certainly understandable. But as these cases show, many times ETs are visiting people not for the purposes of experimentation, as is often speculated, but to actually heal a person. Here's another case. I like this one. This lady had the courage to come forward, speak publicly about her encounters, allowed her real name to be used. Again, there's not a whole lot of information about this case. She never wrote a book. As far as I know, her case has never been fully documented. But I call this one Miracle Legs. This one occurred in November of 1995 in Sacramento, California. And it's a fascinating case. Another one of someone who claims to have been healed in their hospital room by extraterrestrials. In November of 1995, Connie Isele of Sacramento, California, and her friends were in a tragic automobile accident which left Connie gravely injured. And in fact, at the hospital, doctors told Connie that her leg would have to be amputated. Connie, as you can imagine, was not happy about this, but she had strong faith that her ET friends could heal her, as she had already experienced healings from them before. So while in her hospital room and in desperation, she prayed to the ETs for help, and she is convinced that they responded. As she says, it was an extraordinary feeling to wake up, alive. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw an ET, a very tall being with whom I was familiar. When I turned to look at him directly, he was no longer there. But to everyone's amazement, Connie recovered quickly, and her leg was saved. The doctors, she says, were also very much stunned, to the point that they gave her the nickname, quote, Miracle Legs. So many cases. What's really interesting about Connie Isele's case is she fits the pattern of people who are being healed. She is a therapist. In so many cases of people who are doing good work for humanity in some capacity who are healed by extraterrestrials. They are helping those who help others. This is exactly what they told a couple that I interviewed personally who asked them, why did you heal us? Because the gentleman was healed of carpal tunnel syndrome and a bad knee. And they said exactly that. We're helping those who help others. They asked them, why don't you just come down and fix everything? They said, we can't do that. You've created your own problems. It's up to you to solve them. And they are not going to step in and just save us. So it's real puzzling about who gets healed and why, but there are patterns. Again, people who are helping others are far more likely to be healed by ETs. Now let's move to the next case, which I call completely healed. This occurred in 2002 in Italy. There's almost zero information about this case. It's just a brief mention. But I am including it because of the researcher. He's really quite prolific, and I think within the community of UFO researchers, very well respected. As reported by respected researcher Wendell Stevens, it was around 2002 or 2003 that a man in Italy was cured of cancer while in the hospital. This healing may have gone unnoticed, except for the fact that it was allegedly recorded on video and observed on the monitor in the nurse's station. The tape reportedly showed 3 humanoid figures wearing light blue iridescent suits like, quote, fish scales. These figures glowed with light from their arms and legs. They carried a strange instrument in their hands. This tape allegedly shows them entering the room, passing this instrument up and down the man's body, at which point he was, quote, completely healed. That's all the information I was able to find on this case, but it's certainly fascinating. Oh, how I would love to have much more information on these cases. Unfortunately, I don't, so I am just bringing you all the information that I could find on each of these cases. But again, it's the huge number of them that I think speaks most loudly to the veracity of these cases. And here's another one, which is definitely one of my favorite because it is very well authenticated. It does have multiple witnesses, not just the patient, but his wife, who was there when it happened. I call this one, They Cured Me. This occurred in 2005 in Miami, Florida. The witness is very credible, and this case was investigated not only by Ray Hernandez, who's quite prominent in the UFO community, but Dr. Joseph Burks, MD, who's also a UFO researcher and experiencer. It's an important case, I think. In 2005, retired federal drug enforcement agent Alberto Fernandez of Miami, Florida, was diagnosed with lung cancer. Earlier, he had battled and recovered from prostate cancer, but a later follow-up visit revealed a baseball-sized mass in his lungs. In fact, it was so severe that his doctors ordered immediate surgery. Alberto had experienced UFO contact throughout his life and had earlier experienced a healing from a torn cornea. He had no reason, however, to expect a second healing. He was admitted to the local hospital, accompanied by his wife. He was being readied for more x-rays when something very strange happened. As he was laying on the exam table, his entire body started to vibrate with unusual energy, and he shouted out to his wife, "They're here! They're here!" And it was interesting because his wife now saw that the curtain surrounding her husband's bed was moving in this strange pattern, which she described as similar to a sine wave. She rushed to her husband and observed his whole body shaking violently. Seconds later, the shaking stopped, and Alberto told his wife, "They cured me." The x-ray technician returned, completed the x-rays, then gave them to the specialist who was going to treat Alberto, and the specialist reviewed the x-rays and became irate because these x-rays showed that Alberto Fernandez's lungs were completely healthy. There was no sign of any tumor. And in fact, the specialist actually accused Alberto and his original doctor of wasting his time. Now, Alberto's original doctor, who had diagnosed the cancerous mass, reviewed the new x-rays and verified the disappearance of the mass. There are so many cases of people who've been cured of tumors and cancer itself, which is super interesting because this is something that is one of the top 10 killers of people in the world, and ETs are there healing. So that makes it a very important case, and again, very well authenticated. Now let's move to this next case, which is quite poignant. And I mentioned earlier that not all healings are 100% successful, and that's true in this case. I call this one, They Looked Like Praying Mantis. This took place in 2008 in Canada, and this is purely anecdotal in that it's based on one person's eyewitness testimony, but certainly a fascinating case of someone who was healed by ETs of an apparent head wound. The main witness in this case is Andrea. This is a pseudonym. This case again took place in Canada, and I'll just let Andrea describe what happened. As she says, "My best friend was viciously attacked and left to die in 2008. She barely survived the horrible attack where she was knocked unconscious after being hit on the head over and over with an object. When I saw her at the hospital, she was unrecognizable. Her beautiful face was swollen to the size of a basketball." So Andrea was devastated. She had known her friend for 40 years. They had grown up together. But now, following this attack, her friend was laying in this hospital bed in a drug-induced coma. Part of her skull had actually been removed to reduce pressure from the inflammation. Because of the delicacy of her condition, Andrea was not allowed to touch her friend. But she did visit her and would stand by her bed and meditate on healing. Now, when she performed a healing like this, Andrea sometimes says she felt as though she seemed to be, quote, "another person, working with accuracy and knowledge that I wouldn't have had in real life." In fact, one evening as she was meditating on healing her friend, Andrea had a very vivid vision of a huge black spot on her friend's head, and out of it came hundreds of giant spiders. This seemed like a good sign, but unfortunately her friend's condition did not appear to improve. Andrea was in despair. She remained by her friend's bedside but was unable to help her. Finally, she was reaching a point of panic. She felt a sense that, quote, something had to be done quickly or her friend would die. And it was at that moment, she says, that two praying mantis type beings appeared. And again, I'll just let Andrea describe it in her own words. As she says, "All of a sudden, there were two beings that appeared next to my friend. They seemed to push me aside and silently went to work on her like skilled surgeons. They stood to her left, standing together and working furiously on my friend. I had no idea who they were or what they were doing. I thought they looked like praying mantis. Never in a million years could I make this up." So Andrea at that time had no idea that other people reported ETs that looked like praying mantids. At the time of this incident, in fact, she was so amazed by what was happening, she was unable to observe everything clearly. She was in absolute shock. And suddenly she realized that these figures were doing something to her friend. And as she says, "I focused on my friend and saw her head was split wide open, like these aliens sliced it perfectly open. I saw freshly sliced raw flesh, and these alien praying mantis were busily removing pieces of bone, rock, or whatever from her brain. These two alien praying mantis worked quickly, without speaking one word." At this point, Andrea says she seemed to, quote, black out. She is unable to remember anything else about what happened. She did tell her friends about the incident, who told her that, yes, people do see praying mantis type ETs. She did not know that. They advised her to search the internet, and she was absolutely surprised to find many other accounts involving these same type of beings. So Andrea hoped that following this visit by these mantids, her friend would be completely cured. Unfortunately, it was not to be. As Andrea says, "I'm sad to say that even with the alien healing, my friend survived only another 2 weeks before she died. It's just remarkable that she survived at all after her injuries. I don't know why I experienced this, but it's something I will never forget. Sincerely, and oh yes, this is 100% truth, the whole story." Well, as far as I know, that case was not professionally investigated. The testimony of the witness is so sincere, so emotional, that it just has the ring of truth to me. I don't know, you can make up your own minds about it, but certainly another example of ETs visiting someone in their hospital room and at least attempting to heal them. Here's another one. This is a really interesting case. This is the final one in this collection. And again, I do have some questions about it because it only comes from one source, but it's quite detailed. I call this one a shining golden light. This took place fairly recently, February 2009 in Andorra, Spain. I wasn't able to find any further verification about it, but I present it here for what it's worth. This is the last case I'm going to present today. This comes from UFO researchers John Van Allen and Willie Dennard, who say that in February 2009, a fantastic UFO contact took place at the Pyrenees Children's Hospital in Andorra, Spain. They say they interviewed no less than 14 doctors and staff members who told them that extraterrestrials had appeared in the cancer ward of the hospital and performed cures on at least 4 children who were terminal and about to die. These ETs were seen by all who were present and were described as about 4.5 feet tall, with large heads, large almond-shaped eyes, and brownish skin. One of the witnesses was Nurse Lupe Montoya. She was working in the pediatric oncology ward when the first visit occurred. As she says, "I was filling out reports when I looked up and saw 2 little creatures as they moved towards me along the corridor. At first I thought that 2 of the boys were out of their beds, so I got up to bring them back to their rooms. But when I approached, I saw that they were not human and did not look like something that is on this planet. I was scared because it seemed so strange, but at the same time, I felt a feeling. I was sensing kindness, love, and intelligence in those strange eyes." So she watched as these 2 beings walked into the room of 7-year-old Juan Lopez, who you can see here, who was at the end stages of leukemia and expected to die within the week. She called for the security guards and called over Dr. Tomas Ruiz, who was treating another patient. And Tomas, as he says in his own words, "When we entered the room of the small Juan, it was bathed in a shining golden light. The aliens were standing next to his bed. There seemed to be a mystic bond between them and the boy. One of the beings touched the front of Juan gently with his long finger, and he was immediately surrounded in an aura of light. The 2 beings then immediately exited the room and left the hospital as mysteriously as they arrived. Per Dr. Tomas Ruiz, immediately they performed x-rays and blood tests on 7-year-old Juan, and to their amazement, the boy was, quote, completely free of cancer, healed. And this remarkable event turned out to be just the beginning, because it was over the next month that these ETs returned on 3 separate occasions. Each time, they chose a young child who was on the verge of dying from cancer and allegedly healed them. 9-year-old Maria Muñoz, 8-year-old Anita Pina, and 9-year-old Hector Gomez each allegedly received a miraculous cure. And as Dr. Tomas Ruiz told the investigators, and I quote, "There is a pattern in these visits. They always occur at 1 a.m., and the ETs always come in pairs and always heal with a touch to the forehead." Now, according to UFO researcher Diego Garcia, the Pyrenees have been a hotspot for UFO activity for many years. An amazing case, and it's interesting to me that there are multiple healings going on in that case. So super interesting. I mean, that's 17 cases, and honestly, I suspect there are far, far more than this, because most people are not going to report it. There is certainly a phenomenon known as spontaneous remission, and doctors are quite puzzled about this many times. It's very well documented. People will have a sudden reversal of their condition, whatever it might be. And I think many of these cases could very well have been due to the intervention of extraterrestrials. And let's face it, it's not just extraterrestrials healing people. There are angelic healings. Healing can come from a wide variety of sources. And it's quite possible that some of these cases might be what we would consider to be angels. And vice versa. Some of the angelic healings might very well be ETs. But so many cases. Again, 300 plus cases of healings. And there are cases, I mean, here's one from Helga Moro, involving a doctor by the name of Professor Bocharishoni, who is a mental health doctor from Tbilisi, Georgia, who said that he was visited by ETs who gave him information on how to heal people. This is also not unusual. Many people who have an encounter feel that they have gained some ability to do psychic healing, or will develop a sudden interest in medicine in general and will become doctors. It's a really fascinating aspect of UFO encounters that I think deserves much more attention and much more study. It's one of the reasons I wanted to do this episode today. I think it's important because it shows, one, that there's always hope. Two, ETs can visit a person anywhere. Three, chronic conditions are clearly not chronic if they can be healed. Four, there's all kinds of things we can learn from the ETs about medicine. It's clear that they are far more advanced than we are. Again, these cases were covered in my book, The Healing Power of UFOs, which documents more than 300 cases. And again, it's probably double that by now. I might have to do a sequel or a new edition because I keep getting new cases. And I suspect that some of you out there are going to share some of your own healings, because that usually is what happens whenever I speak about this. And again, I'm not saying that every person has a benevolent encounter. I know that some people have a real difficult time with UFO contact, but I maintain that they are not here to hurt, harm, torture, or do any kinds of sadistic things that humans do to each other. I think a close, objective look at the onboard experience in particular shows a very clear-cut pattern. People are taken on board and physically examined. This is when they're often healed. But then they're usually, if they're not in a complete panic and end up with missing time and just put back in their homes, they usually will be given a tour of the craft, shown the engine room, told how it works, taken to the observation deck, shown the Earth far below, or more often a star field, but sometimes the moon or other planets, or even beyond the solar system. They are sometimes taken to the control room, told how the ETs fly the craft, even sat down in the pilot's seat and given a chance to fly the craft itself. Not as unusual as you might think. In fact, Grant Cameron wrote a whole book called Sky Pilots about people who were taught how to pilot the craft. And of course, my book Symmetry is all about Dolly Safran and her experiences with exactly this. So yeah, ETs will also provide all kinds of information about a person's personal life, the life path they're taken, but information in general, which usually falls into the category of warnings of nuclear proliferation, warnings against war and aggression, greed and corruption, pollution, and the destruction of the environment. Also, there's a very strong and prominent spiritual aspect to UFO encounters. People often describe it as being very much like a spiritual enlightenment, lifting the veil from their eyes, and opening them up to a whole new paradigm. And in fact, also, it awakens their psychic abilities to an unbelievable degree. And it's the rule rather than the exception that people come away from an encounter and experience such things as precognition, astral projection, clairvoyance, telepathy, mediumship, channeling, remote viewing, physical levitation. I did a whole episode just on that. And of course, healing, the ability to heal others. It's really quite prominent. So yeah, just underlining that people have many healing encounters. So that's it for today. I hope you've learned something. I hope you found it interesting. Thank you very much for watching. I truly appreciate it. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions, keep searching for the truth, and most important of all, keep having fun. I will see you next episode. Bye for now.